Alrighty. Let's go. Okay. Then I will go ahead and get started. If everybody's ready. So this one's covering game analysis. Um, I'm not going to be covering everything about identify the problem, but if any of you have any questions about that, you can also drop those and I will answer them. Okay, so these are your general guidelines. Some things to include that are pretty much necessary are your elements, your rules, and how you score. Beyond that, there's some optional things like offensive and defensive strategies, task priority orders, your scoring goals, and even the section like how to guarantee a win. But again, they're optional, so you don't have to do them. But I'll go ahead and walk you through some good practices for all of them. So for the elements, one of the biggest things I see is a ton of images that aren't really beneficial. So I would say my best advice there is condense them all into a single annotated picture. You can show the element, or if it's not an element, say it's a goal like this over-under goal, you can show that and also have notes like dimensions out to the side, and it'll help reduce the amount of space that your game analysis is taking. In addition to that, you'll want to include some general important notes like the materials, the dimensions, and even potentially like how to score. So like your SC rules might go here. So again, with that over-under example, I don't particularly like this format because the paragraph is kind of difficult to read, but you could easily turn that into bullet points. And then you have how to score it, and then you have your observations. Again, these observations aren't the best. They could use some development, but the main part that I wanted to show there was you have your fact and then you have some kind of analysis on it. So, for example, on the goalpost, it says it extends 3 inches around, and then the reason why that matters is that the robot can't move into the goal from the very edge of the openings, which is just saying like that little conical base there. Yeah, just important.
You're wrong. Pretty sure.
Yeah. So then for rules, I know one of the big things about this is that people don't know which rules to include. So I went through and just pulled out the types of rules and what I would do with treating them. So your SC rules are your scoring rules. I would disperse these where they're relevant, but I wouldn't separate them out. So for example, how blocks are scored could be under the block element section. You know, what how you score in the tubes can be under the tube element section or things like that. You don't need to make it its own separate category. Your S rules are your safety rules. I don't ever see this being worth including. Same with your G rules. I think that's for general rules. These are like your G1, G2, G3. It's basically just common sense and don't say mean things. Like, that's not necessarily something that should go in the notebook. Your general game rules, a lot of them aren't necessary, but there's a couple like don't grapple onto things, don't shoot parts off of your robot, things like that. I would just summarize them into like a DQ list because that's really where the majority of the DQs are going to happen, especially for pushback. It's just like, don't do this stuff, guys. This is just things that your robots aren't supposed to do. So I would just summarize those. You don't need to go into any kind of elaborate detail. You don't need to include all of them, etc. Your specific game rules, your SG rules, again, same with the SC rules, I would disperse them where relevant. And that might not necessarily be under the elements, but like this is where your expansion rules are found. So that might go under your robot limit rules, which ties into the next one, which are your robot rules. I would only include, there's like 25, 26 of these, I think. I think I have like maybe 5 included at most. A lot of them aren't really relevant and or can be combined under other rules. So for example, you have your SG2, your SG3, and I think it's R1, which are basically all of your size constraints. All of those can be combined into the same bullet point with all 3 of those just referenced. And that'll definitely help you cut down space and just efficiency of displaying things. But some other things to include into that would be, your watt limit, your air limit, your plastic limits found under your robot rules. That one's a good one to include as well. But like, even like your part rules, so like what screws, spacers, etc., tape, whatever you want, I don't think that those are necessarily worth including, unless you're making a specific point about it. Say, for example, you have, I don't know, a lighter alternative, or you're doing something specifically for strength or something like that, then it's worth noting. But I wouldn't even note that in your analysis section. I would just note that in your build or your design section or whatever. I don't think that has to be a part of your game analysis specifically. Then you got your skills rules. Again, there's like 4 of these. The only really relevant one, especially this year, is the differences in scoring. That's the main one that I would include. And I guess technically that your field is set up differently, but that doesn't necessarily need to be its own whole big thing. It can kind of just go under a general skills evaluation. And the last one that I get a lot of questions about, it's the last rule category, it's your tournament rules. I would say pretty much none of these are worth including, with the exception of maybe like T5, which is expect variation in your element and your field setup and whatnot. Like, I could understand how that would be, how you would want that to be incorporated into your robot design, either through, being able to pick up blocks in various orientations, or, within plus or minus an inch, or maybe you want to make it as a programming note that you want to be accurate to plus or minus an inch because there's no more accurate than that because of variation from the elements. Whatever it is you want to relate to that. That's pretty much the only tournament rule that I see being applicable to including game analysis. I definitely would stay away from, how elimination brackets work, how like tournament refs have the final say. All that stuff isn't really necessary to you or your team. And it's important to remember also that the goal of the game analysis isn't to be a regurgitation of the game manual. It's just meant to be what's relevant to you and your team. Here's an example of how to do the rule evaluations if you're including it, like however you choose to. On the left is what you should not do. It's just a pasted screenshot from the manual with essentially text saying the exact same thing. There's no point in doing that. Like I said, your game analysis is not a regurgitation of the manual. They don't want to read the manual. This is lengthy. This is obnoxious. There's no point in doing it. A much better format would be like on the right side, where you break it into, your elements and then your related robot rules, where you have your expansion rules detailed out just in a single summary sentence, because you don't need everything in SG2 and SG3 to say the essence of it, which is a 22-inch cube. One thing that's important to keep in mind is that when they're writing the game manual, they're writing it to avoid teams finding loopholes. But when you're writing your notebook, the only thing that matters is that you capture the intent of the rule. So you don't have to list out every specification, because there's nobody trying to circumvent those rules using your notebook. I think it's important just to remember why each document is being written, and use that to help guide what you choose to include out of each rule and what you choose to overlook. which it's pretty straightforward this year, but whenever you have games like High Stakes last year with the 6 inches out of only one side, like I know people who copied the entire page worth of legal examples and illegal examples, and it's just not necessary because, like I said, what you're really looking at is how it's relevant to you. So if you don't want to expand that way, like you know not to do it just with saying you can only expand one side 6 inches. And then you can just have one picture for every couple of rules. Don't feel forced to put pictures in just for the sake of having pictures. And it's okay to show multiple things within the same picture. Because, like, for example, here you've got your blue that's your starting at size, and then your yellow shows your expansion. Now, is this a great diagram? No, not really. But it gives you the idea that you start with something small and you can end with something bigger. Uh, Next section that you want to include is scoring. Um, you definitely want to include analysis on your scoring. Don't just include your traditional table or pie chart, which I actually have in the top graph. That is the over/under scoring breakdown. You don't want to just include that. You want to include some analysis on it, like what's the easiest to score, what's worth the most points, what is guaranteed to the alliance versus what are you fighting your opponents for. For example, in over under, your guaranteed points would be your alliance colored triballs, and the things that you're fighting your opponents for would be the green triballs. In high stakes, your guaranteed colored points, of course, barring your negative corners, would be your respective ring colors, and the things that you're fighting your alliance for, or not your alliance, your opponents for, would be the mobile goals, the wall stakes, the positive corners, things like that. Then just, keeping in mind what's easiest to score. In over under, that would be just scoring it in the low zone, or I forgot the names actually. The offensive zone, I think it was called. And then obviously in the goal would be harder because you have that additional effort of having to push it in. Yeah. For high stakes, what you might see as easiest to score for climbing in particular, for example, would be tier 1 versus tier 3 is much more difficult to score, even though it's worth more points. So just taking into account those kinds of things. Also taking into account what can be grouped under the same robot functionality. For example, your intake could also potentially be your outtake. It's important to note that you can do certain functions with the same system. Just because the fewer amount of systems you have, the less complicated your robot's going to be, and the overall better that's going to be because, you're not going to have your robot breaking or anything like that. So less complicated is better, and a good way to achieve that is fewer systems. But for example, you can't necessarily intake triballs and hang at H tier all with the same mechanism. So it's important to note, like, those are variations in functionality. So some other options for graphs that you have just to make your scoring analysis more dynamically visually is something like this bottom one I have, which is actually also from Over Under. It's looking at how much each individual objective is worth, and then how much that objective can be worth as a whole. So, for example, one tribal in the goal was worth, I think, 5 points. I don't even remember anymore. But yeah, or your rings, for example. One ring on a mobile goal was worth 1 point, but you had, what, 48 rings? 24 rings? I think it was 24 rings. So, it'd be worth a total of 24. Of course, that's not including your top ring bonuses and things like that. But it gives you an idea. Whereas something like Tier 3 is worth 12 points individually, but you can only achieve that a single time. So in that case, your individual points and your overall points might be the same, and your points per objective are pretty high, which might mean that it's more worth it, might mean that it's less worth it. It depends on other factors as well. So just another way of making your analysis more dynamic. But it's also a good way of picking, like, for example, are we going to score 50% of the rings or 75% of the rings, or how much is truly needed to get the points required. Yeah. This goes, now we're starting into the optional things to include in game analysis. The first of which is your offensive and defensive strategies. This is pretty straightforward. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but you basically just list out, this one's for pushback, what's considered offensive. Normally, this is anything that is directly scoring points, which in this case is pretty much just scoring blocks and parking. And then anything defensive would be anything that's focused on keeping other people from scoring points. So pushing robots off tubes, or hoarding blocks, or even just also, I didn't add this one, but descoring blocks from tubes. And then just worth noting that whichever of these two strategies you pick, you want to have an idea of the systems required. So, for your basic offensive robot, it's going to be some kind of drive, some kind of intake, some kind of outtake, and optionally some kind of holding system if you want to hold more than, say, one block at a time. For your defensive strategies, again, you're still going to have to move around, so you're still going to need a drive. If you're going with hoarding block strategy, you're going to need an intake. If you're going with descore strategy, you're going to need some kind of descore mechanism. And if you're going with the hoarding strategy, again, you're going to need some kind of holding system to actually be able to successfully hoard. So just keeping in mind, what are these robots going to look like based off the strategies that we're selecting to implement. It's a good way to bridge the gap between your analysis and your actual robot design as well, because it's not always evident exactly where you should go from this is the game we're playing to this is how we're going to play it. Second optional thing is task priority order. This isn't super necessary. I would say this is one of the lesser necessary optional things to include, but it's just, again, looking at more things to consider. Looking at your windows, so when can certain tasks be completed? For example, endgame is when parking is going to be completed, or climbing, or whatever your endgame objective is going to be. Like, that time should be dedicated to that, but that's also important to note that, for example, last year, there were some things that stopped being able to be completed at certain points. So, like pulling opponent goals out of positive corners. You want to make sure that happens before endgame. And you might also want to evaluate something like, is negating points of our opponents in a negative corner worth more to us strategically than, say, climbing or going to tier 3, or what exactly is realistically possible in that sense. And then just the same with autonomous. How can you score the most points the most effectively while still balancing out your win point requirements, things like that. You also want to look at your holding potential. So, do tasks require defending? So, for example, from D-score, this would be particularly relevant in pushback. Looking at the long tubes are harder to D-score in than the short central tubes. So maybe you're looking at filling up the long tubes, up until the last 10-15 seconds, where then you transition to the shorter tubes so that your opponents don't necessarily have time to D-score the long tubes, and you're not wasting your time continuously scoring and then getting D-scored and then scoring and D-scoring in the shorter central tubes. And some other things you might look at, which I kind of mentioned previously, was how much is a task worth individually, how much are they worth altogether. Parking is only worth 8 points, so maybe this is lower on your priority list just because you can get, 25-ish points from a long goal. Just taking into account those kind of things. Another thing you want to take into account is task dependencies. So, looking at what tasks are dependent on other tasks being completed and what tasks are dependent on alliance partners. So, for example, your control bonuses have a high task dependency because they rely on blocks of your color being in that central control section, which relies on you being able to score blocks and them not getting descored, etc., etc. An example of a task that's dependent on your alliance partner would be double park. And the more dependencies a task has, usually the more difficult it's going to be to achieve, and that might mean that it's either lower on your priority list if it's just not worth that many points, or if those points can be made up another way, or it might push it much higher on your priority list because it's difficult to achieve, and you have to have a lot of setup for it, and you want to make sure that you can get everything actually achieved with that. So, just something worth noting and thinking about when you're establishing your strategies and what you are wanting your robot to do. And this, again, I've already mentioned, but how easy are tasks to be completed? Parking solo is incredibly easy. You drive over the barrier, boom, you're parked pretty much. Whereas, you know, again, securing those long goal bonuses, you have to completely fill that central goal, that central zone with like 3 balls, and you have to have a way of getting them there and then protecting them. And that's obviously going to decrease how easily you're going to be able to complete that task. Again, that's up to your team whether you decide to choose it or not, but it's just definitely important to note because that's the kind of thinking that you're showing in your notebook that's going to elevate your game analysis beyond just your regurgitation of the manual, and it's going to help turn it into something meaningful. Again, optional, but can be interesting to include are your scoring goals. So how many points do you want to score? How are you going to get them? Where did this number come from? This is an example from my Rise Above IQ notebook. Really just saying, like, what has scoring looked like in past competitions? In this case, it's looking at a percentage of points that the top teams were scoring, and then translating that percentage of points to the current game. Now, the limitations of this thinking are that you don't account for strategical differences. It's just a pure numerically analyzed value. But something that you could look at for example, analyzing high stakes, scoring potential would be taking into account how your H tier from over under factored into your final scores. And then just looking at, is that worth it from the perspective of, do you really need it to help you achieve that high of a score? Maybe those games had a lower percentage of points total out of the scored potential, and it's okay not to complete those requirements because past games have shown that it's, not required to be competitive. Yeah, that's, again, optional, but can be beneficial. I think this is the last section. This is actually one of the sections that I like to include. This was my high stakes analysis from last year. It's just guaranteeing a win. And really, it's just, what do you need to win? I look at it in terms of 3 different ways. The first is an absolute win. This usually translates to, quite simply, half the points. Now, if there's points that you can score and points that your opponent can score, that might make things factor in a little weirdly, but a good rule of thumb is that usually it's going to be you scoring half the available points, and that's going to guarantee a win. Now, sometimes this can be really difficult. It's a lot of points. It's more than you can feasibly achieve, or necessarily should try to feasibly achieve, because you might be taking greater risks than necessary. So the second way that you want to look at guaranteeing a win is guaranteeing a practical win. And this is essentially, yes, there's things your opponents can do, but it's very unlikely that they're going to happen. So, for example, an over-under, D-score, at least initially, early season wasn't necessarily a thing, and it still takes time. So that might be looking at, maybe we don't need half the try balls scored in our, or we don't need, I guess like one more than half of the try ball scored in our goal. Maybe we only need a third of them because our opponents aren't going to be able to make up the difference if we can score quickly and then play defense, and or if we have de-score capabilities ourselves, etc. Like, what is logically necessary to win, but not necessarily guaranteeing you the win, if that makes sense. The last way is a strategical win, and this is similar to the practical win, but it's more so looking at the balances between points. So, for example, high stakes is a pretty good example, actually. One of the big things that was looked at was negative corners versus climbing to tier 1 versus tier 2 versus tier 3. A strategical win might be viewing it as it's okay to leave your negative corner in the last 3 seconds to get a tier 1 hang on the ladder under the condition that your opponents probably aren't going to be able to get that goal out of the negative corner within the last 3 seconds that you're leaving it in. Especially if they're somewhere else on the field or trying to elevate themselves or whatever. So it's looking at the strategical balances between what are they giving up. That also works like the other way around. If your opponents are going for a tier 3, then you might be able to strategically win over them by stealing their goals and putting them in negative corner consequently, because there's not going to be much they're able to do when they are going up themselves. So just looking at like strategically what can you do to win, and what are your opponents or you giving up by completing various tasks. Another good example in pushback would be descoring your tubes versus going for that solo or double park. Like, are you giving up the potential that your goals are going to be descored, or whatever strategy that encompasses is just noting that and figuring out where you're going with that. Yeah. One thing that I wanted to briefly cover on was images, because I know a lot of people don't necessarily know what's a good rule of thumb for that. For elements, I would say 1 image per element. I think I said that before, but try to condense it all to where the information is displayed on one. For the rules, only include it if it's necessary. Maybe 1 out of every 3 rules will have one. Your expansion can have one. Maybe your plastic has one, although I don't necessarily know that that's important anymore. Unless you want to show like the 4x8 by 0.7 inch sizing of it. You could have like a table for your watt limit with what you can have for 5.5 versus 11 watt. Like, that would be a nice visual to have there. But you don't necessarily need to include every single image for every single scoring, everything, whatever you want. Yeah, for scoring, I would just say 1 or 2 graphs, whatever's necessary. Beyond that, you shouldn't need much. Strategies, it's up to you. It could be cool to have some strategies diagrammed out, but I can see this being really spacey really quickly. So I wouldn't worry about it too much, especially because, well, yeah. A flowchart could be nice for your task priority order. You could have an autonomous flowchart, a regular match play flowchart, and then an endgame flowchart. I've actually seen this done very well in some notebooks. That would make a nice visual for that. Scoring goals. I don't think this, again, I think I mentioned this paragraph form isn't great. Just a small note somewhere is fine. You don't necessarily need a visual for this either. Like, it's perfectly okay to just have a scoring note for that. And then this one, kind of like I have in this example here, I would include the the images, like just screenshots off of the VEX Hub app that lets you put in the scoring stuff, and just to show it does help. You can also tell that this one's pretty text heavy, but though having those images does help visualize things. Yeah. I'm going to see if there's any questions, although last I checked, there wasn't anything, so it doesn't look like any were posted. Do any of you guys want to write any out, or any lingering thoughts? You can probably stop streaming now, Millen.